Out of the darkness comes humanity's worst nightmares. Creatures with an appetite to kill and blood in their teeth. They war against truth, love, logic, and goodness. Although these creatures do not simply go bump in the night, nor are they torn from the pages of mythology. They are very real and are closer to home than you think. I'm talking about human beings, namely villains. In this series, we are going to look at some villains, specifically the villains brought to us in the biblical texts. Who were they? What did they do? Why did they do it? And what lessons can we learn? This is Villains of the Bible. Every step away from obedience begins with a compromise. That was said by Vance Havner. If there was one word that could accurately characterize the main problems of the world we live in, it would be compromise. Not the good compromise in making deals or lowering one's pride, but almost the inverse. The kind of compromise one makes when shaking the hand of the devil and allowing oneself to become polluted by it. A compromise that one takes by pushing their fellow sheep over, exposing their stomachs to the wolves so that they can get away, polluting themselves with evil in the process. The evil of compromise is seen all throughout the biblical texts, from Adam's passive compromise with evil by listening to his wife, down to Judas Iscariot's active compromise with evil, betraying the most righteous man who ever lived, Jesus. Today, we will be discussing one figure in the biblical text who not only actively and passively compromised with evil, polluting his soul along the way, but also gained a reputation of the most wicked king in all of biblical history, a true villain. Who is that? Allow me to direct your attention to this. It is a replica of an extraordinary archaeological find called the Kirk monolith. The real one is much bigger, 6 feet bigger. It's from around 852 BC, and it describes King Shalmaneser III's victory at the Battle of Karkar, where he defeated a coalition of 12 kings and their forces. Now, why is this important? Because it's one of, if not the only, archaeological finds that mentions a certain king by name, King Ahab of Israel. King Ahab is rightfully called a villain when we understand who he was, what he did, and what he allowed to happen in many cases. In the Bible, he's given a review of his character that is truly striking and one that is not given to anyone else after him. In 1 Kings chapter 21, it tragically says, quote, "There was none who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, like Ahab, whom Jezebel his wife incited. He acted very abominably in going after idols, as the Amorites had done, whom the Lord cast out before the people of Israel." End quote. Scary words. Words that you would never want to be spoken about you, but words that are absolutely fitting for this villain. This description shows both an active and a passive role in his devotion to evil. He sold himself to do evil and allowed himself to be influenced, you could even say guided by his wife, to do evil as well. The consequence was a dark pollution of his soul. But this type of man wasn't self-made, shall we say. His evil was heavily influenced by someone who preceded him, namely his father Omri. He was king in Israel before Ahab, and it says about him that he, quote, "did what was evil in the sight of the Lord more than anyone who was before him," end quote. That description is telling for Ahab's father and also Ahab. If Ahab's father was described as an unmatchable evil in Israel, and then it later says the same thing about Ahab, that tells us how bad Ahab must have been. Ahab would surpass the evil of his father. Ahab began his reign in Israel in 874 BC. He was the seventh king there since the legendary split between Judah and Israel, a split that would define the rest of Israel's history, unfortunately. A history of rebellion, corruption, spiritual pollution, and depraved idolatry. A tradition that Ahab would proudly continue in his time. It's said about Ahab in Talmud Sanhedrin, quote, "Not only did he sin, but he caused Israel to sin," end quote. We all know that it's bad enough to commit to evil, but to assist others in compromising with evil as well, that's what villains do. How did he do that, though? By being assisted himself to compromise. And he was assisted by a wife that he took, whose name is remembered to this day in no positive light: Jezebel. Not surprisingly, King Ahab, treading God's commands under his feet, took a wife from a foreign nation, which was forbidden in Deuteronomy 7. God forbid it because he knew it would draw people away from him and into some of the most sickening practices observed by pagan culture. Ahab took Jezebel, daughter of a Sidonian king, which means two things. It was a political marriage, and she was a Phoenician. Her father, being king in that culture, also meant he was a priest, but a priest to who? To the gods Baal and Asherah. It's no surprise then that after it mentions that Ahab married Jezebel, it reports altars and poles going up in the land of Israel for those same pagan gods. Influenced by his wife, paganism was now mainstream in the land of Israel, possibly more than it ever had been before. It's said about Ahab in Yokalt Shimoni, quote, "Ahab wrote upon the gates of Samaria, Ahab has no portion in the God of Israel. He sent heralds throughout Israel and Judah to bring sorcerers and practitioners of witchcraft to counsel him," end quote. There are two things needing to be covered about this. First, why God says witchcraft, sorcery, and worshiping other gods is wrong. Second, the impact that this had on the people. The student of the Bible knows very well that God never gives instructions just because. Outside of the reality that not following them goes against God's holiness, it's also true that God, in giving commands, protects us from unseen dangers, things that our tiny human minds cannot comprehend the implications of. Worshipping other gods is one of those dangers. It's revealed in the biblical text that these gods are not merely statues. They were demons that once let in the door from the other side become dangerous to our world and the people that are exposed to them. Which leads me to the second, the impact that it had on the people. In order to answer that, we have to understand what gods, what demons are now being worshipped in Israel. Baal and Asherah, gods of fertility, storm, and agriculture, sometimes more. What they provided, which in reality was nothing, wasn't as important as what constitutes as worship for them. First, a disregard for the respect of God. In their blending of religions, it would be revealed through archaeological sources that Asherah was the wife of Yahweh, that in some way God listened to her or even submitted to her. This blasphemy of God would be emblematic of Ahab listening to his wife, Jezebel. Such a disrespect of God would have lowered him in the people's esteem, making it difficult for the people to take warnings of judgment from God quite as serious. Second, temple prostitution. A degradation of themselves with each other, once forbidden by God, was now celebrated as worship for these demon gods. Giving the illusion of sexual freedom would have come with consequences. Sexual diseases would have become rampant, plaguing society with no hope of a cure. Also, unwanted pregnancies would have increased. But that wouldn't be a problem for them, because in their synchronistic worship of these gods, blending with worship practices of other gods, like Molech, the third thing to remember is that child sacrifice became a staple, offering their very own babies to a consuming flame while they screamed in pain. And if they borrowed even more from Molech worship, which there's indication that they did, the cries of searing pain wouldn't be a burden, because they would beat loud drums to drown out the noise. Only a villain would allow this to take place in their society and allow their people to become polluted through their own king's compromise. And that's who Ahab was, through and through, because only a villain could sit back, watch this happen to his people, and not just refuse to lift a finger to stop it, but actually support it, promote it, fund it. He promoted a lot of things in his evil reign that caused death and much suffering. One thing that happened under his reign that didn't seem to be directly commanded by Ahab, but at least allowed under his rule, was the rebuilding of Jericho. This was a place that was destroyed by Israel and came with a warning that if it was ever rebuilt, it would come at the cost of their firstborn and youngest son. And it happened in Ahab's time, just as God said. Surely Ahab's evil and fixation on rebelling against God facilitated this by allowing it as a possibility in the minds of the people. But more suffering would come to the people because of the king. God sent a prophet, Elijah, who told Ahab that because of his evil, there would be a drought in the land for 3 years. The political, economic, and societal implications for a 3-year drought in ancient Israel would have been catastrophic. No rain means no corn, olives, figs, grapes, wheat, or anything else that would be an agricultural staple. They would begin to dig into their own emergency grain supplies until they were depleted. Cattle would also die, which means no meat, no animals to till the ground or do any more labor. And with resources literally drying up, you no longer have many trade options with other countries, so money's drying up too. The fear, terror, and dread of trying to survive every day under these conditions would have been immense. One would expect that this would be the thing that would wake people up and repent of the destruction they brought upon themselves, especially the king. But no, evil continued those 3 years, even to the extent that Ahab actually tried to hunt Elijah down, and not for goodwill. On top of that, Jezebel, not hindered by Ahab, had many prophets of Yahweh killed, probably in a political move to convince people to stay faithful to her gods, that her gods would get them all out of this and that help was on the way. It never came. This famine-causing drought would have been a nightmare for Israel. It got so desperate that King Ahab himself left his palace and went out with a servant of his, Obadiah, to look for grass by springs of water so that perhaps it could save some of the animals. Before we go any further, the text says that Obadiah was a follower of Yahweh and was attributed with doing a very good thing for God's prophets in the land of Israel. He protected them from Ahab and his wicked wife. It's very quickly stated in the text, but has very evil implications. It says that there was a slaughter that took place in Israel, a slaughter of the very prophets of God himself. They were hunted down and killed, every one of them, except a group of around 100 prophets, which Obadiah hid away. Prophets of God were not combatants. They were not political revolutionaries or terrorists. Their only crime was that they didn't serve Jezebel's gods. In fact, they probably spoke out against them. This would have made them actively in Jezebel's mind and passively in Ahab's mind as domestic extremists. Speaking out against the status quo could have delegitimized her gods, her queenship, and Ahab's reign. So she had an unknown number of them killed throughout the land. Now, about that unknown number, if only one man was able to save some of them, that most likely indicates that those killed would have been much higher. And Ahab let her do it. That's what villains do. Now, getting back to Obadiah, he did as directed by the king, and he went out. What he found, though, wasn't water or grass, but Elijah, who was brought to King Ahab. When Ahab saw him, he didn't comment on how correct Elijah was about the drought. Instead, Ahab addressed him as the troubler of Israel. Elijah challenged Ahab to his face with a contest of sorts. Ahab would gather Jezebel's prophets, who served Baal and Asherah, 850 in total, and they were to meet at Mount Carmel to decide whose God was real. Ahab accepted and sent the prophets and all the people of Israel there. This was going to be a massive public event. The contest took place around an altar. Each side would have their turn to summon their god's fire to consume the offering that was sitting on it, and this would go to show whose God was real. Jezebel's prophets were up first. Around 6 to 7 hours, they danced, they pleaded, they cried, and in a way to compel their God to do something, they would cut themselves, bleeding all over the ground, trying to get some sort of response. It never came. Elijah stepped up and doused the altar with water. Remember, water was limited because of the drought. And on the first try, for all to see, God's fire rained down out of heaven, consumed the sacrifices, the water, and the stones of the altar itself. The winner was clear. All Israel saw this. In response and as punishment for the vast evil that they spread throughout the land, the depravity, the child sacrifice, the killing of the prophets of God, Elijah commanded the Israelite onlookers to chase all of those false prophets down and put them to the sword. Ahab saw all of this. He was there. And notice, he doesn't protest. He doesn't defend those false prophets as they were being executed. He lets it happen. Perhaps there was something stirring in Ahab, a humble consideration of events. This is when the drought ends, and Elijah tells Ahab as much. If Ahab were by himself, this could have been a major turning point for him. If it were not for one word: compromise. He told Jezebel all about what happened. Now she threatens to kill Elijah for humiliating her. She fails, of course, but the point is, Ahab is silent. He does not stop her. Jezebel just heard what happened, that the God of Israel was the true God, and it didn't turn her heart at all. Ahab saw it and doesn't try to convince her, but silently compromises yet again. Edmund Burke has a quote that's attributed to him that says, quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing," end quote. Now, Ahab wasn't good by any stretch of the imagination, but the principle was clear. Ahab lets Jezebel take the reins. The evil continues, and he could have stopped it. He doesn't. He lets his wicked bride take control. That's what villains do. A few months to a year later, a man named Ben-Hadad enters this story. He was the king of Syria at this time, and he came making demands of Israel. He wanted their silver, their gold, their women, and their children. In other words, he wanted complete dominance. What happens next is interesting and rare for Ahab. Ben-Hadad had crossed a line, and Ahab was not going to stand for it or capitulate. Ahab stands his ground like a man, and he refuses to roll over and let his kingdom be taken. This is when a prophet of God, not Elijah, comes to him and promises Ahab that God will deliver Ben-Hadad into his hands. In other words, I'll win the fight for you, and you wipe him out. And all for this reason, that Ahab would know that Yahweh is God, and through that, maybe get Israel back on track. The Syrians are drunk in their tents, and Ahab launches his assault. It was a clean victory for Ahab and a humiliating defeat for Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad escapes, but he would be back. God proved himself faithful. The question is, would Ahab? Ben-Hadad returns in the spring, thinking God's power is limited to a location like the hills. So they fight in the plains. A man of God approaches Ahab once again and says God will give all of them into your hand. This is now the second time that the promise was made. In the context of the Bible, when God makes a statement like that, it usually means total annihilation. In other words, kill them all, including Ben-Hadad. The battle takes place. Once again, Ahab is victorious, but instead of killing Ben-Hadad, Ahab does the opposite and then more. He calls him his brother. Ben-Hadad says that he will give back all of the territory that was taken away from Ahab's father by his father. So Ahab compromises once again and makes a covenant with Ben-Hadad, polluting more of his soul, a decision that will cost him his life one day. A prophet of God comes to Ahab to condemn him. God devoted Ben-Hadad to destruction, and Ahab did not do it. So God gives his judgment. Ahab would take Ben-Hadad's place. It was a promise of his death. Ahab's reaction to this is interesting. Instead, he went back to his house, vexed and sullen, because he cared that he disobeyed God? No. This wasn't repentance. This was pouting because he didn't get his way. That's what it meant when Ahab was vexed and sullen, a phrase that would be used later in the story. These types of actions are not typical of villains. Normally, villains show strength to display their evil, and Ahab certainly does that. But in this instance, it's pitiful. It's childlike weakness. Before we go further, sometime after these events, this monolith comes back into play. Scholars and commentators estimate that sometime between Ahab's defeat of Ben-Hadad and the account of Naboth's vineyard, which we'll get into in a moment, the Battle of Karkar takes place, as described in the Kirk monolith. Why is that important, though? Because, like I said, it mentions King Ahab fighting against King Shalmaneser III. I'll read a portion of the monolith translated into English. Quote, I approached the city of Karkar. I razed, destroyed, and burned the city of Karkar, his royal city, 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, and 20,000 soldiers of Hadad-ezer of Damascus, 2,000 chariots, and 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite. End quote. Did you pay attention to who was mentioned there? Hadad of Damascus. Ahab and Ben-Hadad had joined forces in military campaigns, further displaying Ahab's compromise with evil even in history outside of the Bible. We will soon find out in this villain's story that any compromise with the world always comes back to haunt you. Sometime after these events, Ahab is at his palace. He knows there's a very nice vineyard next to it, and he wants it. He goes to its owner, Naboth, and suggests that he give it to him because it's so close to home. Ahab even sweetens the deal, and he says he's either going to give him a bigger vineyard in exchange or give him its value in money. But Naboth refuses. He rightly refuses, being a good Israelite who follows God. He knows it would be against God's law to sell his inheritance. Ahab doesn't put up a fight, which is good. However, he goes back to his house, quote, vexed and sullen. The compromising villain is pouting again. He goes to his chamber, he lays down on his bed, he turns the other way, and he wouldn't eat. I guess that's what some villains do if they were children. If Ahab would have stayed pouting on his bed, and that's as bad as it got, it would have been okay. It becomes a problem when his inciter enters the room. Jezebel, long story short, told Ahab that she would take care of it, which she does. And how does she do this? She wrote letters, forging Ahab's name on them with his seal, telling certain elders and leaders to put Naboth, an innocent man, in the middle of two worthless men who were in the community, and they were known to be troublemakers, lawbreakers, or nuisances. And when they had Naboth in that position, looking guilty by association, they were to accuse him of cursing God and the king, so that the elders could have him executed. The parallel seems awfully familiar. The plan was executed, as was Naboth, an innocent man standing on what he knew was right. And Ahab, knowing full well what was going to happen, led it. He let Jezebel take the reins again. Now an innocent man was dead as well as his sons. That's not mentioned in the text, but would be later revealed in 2 Kings 9, which means their inheritance was stolen too. And if Naboth had a wife, which he probably did, and Naboth's sons as well, those women were left with no source of income, possibly no place to stay, and dead men as their reward, all allowed by Ahab's polluted soul. That's what villains do. God wasn't going to take this, though. So, God sent a prophet Ahab's way, a prophet we haven't heard from in a while. Elijah had returned, bearing with him a message tailored for Ahab and his wicked woman. The same place where the dogs licked up Naboth's blood would be the same place where his blood would be licked up, and all his descendants would be cut off as well. And Jezebel, the dogs wouldn't lick up her blood. Instead, she would be eaten by dogs. Such a strong condemnation of Ahab and what he allowed to do to innocents might have been, for the moment, exactly what Ahab needed to hear. Because for the first time in this narrative, Ahab actually repents. He tore his kingly clothes. He put on sackcloth as a way to show his worthlessness. His heart had been broken, not because he didn't get his way, not because he had consequences, but because he was a villain. And probably for the first time, he saw that. So God granted that the disaster of the annihilation of Ahab's line wouldn't happen in his day, so he wouldn't see it. But he didn't say that Ahab's death wouldn't happen. Which leads us to the last part of this villain's story. 3 years later, Ahab had expressed interest in taking back Ramoth Gilead, which was a very strategic and important trade route, and he wanted to take it back from Syria. Remember, who was the king of Syria? Ben-Hadad had returned to this story. This time, not as an ally, but as an enemy once more. Somewhere along the line, they were back at each other's throats. So he asks the king of Judah, King Jehoshaphat, for help in getting Ramoth Gilead back from Ben-Hadad, a place that, if you remember, would have been one of the territories that was supposed to be returned to Ahab because of the covenant that they made. Jehoshaphat accepts Ahab's request, but he wanted to know what the prophets thought about all of this. The prophets of the Lord, to be exact, so he brings them into the room. This brings an interesting question to mind. How are there any prophets of the Lord available? Weren't they all pagan worshipers there? And weren't the prophets of the Lord killed by Jezebel and the rest had to go into hiding? The answer is probably along these lines. Ahab, Jezebel, the nation of Israel at this time, they were pagans, and pagan worship is rarely, if ever, heartfelt. The gods were simply there to get something out of. Do this, get that sort of a thing. They were a means to an end. Power, control, crops, fertility, and more were all the things people worshipped these gods for. After the humiliating defeat of the prophets of Baal and Asherah at Mount Carmel, it was clear that there was a God who was much more powerful than theirs. So, they might have had some of their prophets convert to start worshiping Elijah's God. The problem would be they would still treat God like a genie whose lamp needed to be rubbed before he would grant those 3 precious wishes of whatever you wanted. To them, he was a means to an end, not God alone. So they inquire of these prophets, 400 of them, and they all said the same thing. Go to battle. God will deliver Ramoth-Gilead into your hand. But Jehoshaphat wasn't buying it. Back in Judah, he knew how prophets worked. If God was truly speaking to a prophet, there was almost always a word of warning, something to consider, maybe even something to contradict their expectations. Something was off. It probably seemed too much like a script to him. So he asks Ahab if maybe there was another prophet. Ahab reveals, yes, there was, but he hated him. That's because he always prophesied bad and not good about Ahab. And his name was Micaiah. They inquire of him. At first, Micaiah sarcastically plays along. Now Ahab is the one who's not buying it, and he commands him to tell the truth. Micaiah reveals that if they would go up, they would lose, and that these prophets that they just listened to were all fed a lie by God's divine counsel, so that God could have Ahab judged and die at the battle. The prophet is beaten and thrown into prison. Ahab seals the fate of his corrupt, polluted, compromising soul. When Ahab goes up to battle, trying to take back Ramoth-Gilead from Ben-Hadad, he seemed to be at least a little worried about what Micaiah said, because he has Jehoshaphat wearing his normal kingly attire, and Ahab would wear the garments of a common soldier. He used Jehoshaphat as bait to throw off the scent from him, probably thinking he could fool the opposing soldiers and God himself, but it wouldn't work, because in God's sovereign providence, a random soldier randomly drew his bow, and it randomly hit Ahab between his breastplate and the scale armor underneath, right in the area under his arm, where there would be no protection. Coincidence? God never responds to villains with coincidence. Ahab was bleeding out in his chariot. At the end of the day, the battle was lost, and Ahab died. When they fled, his chariot was taken back to Samaria, where his blood would drip onto the ground and be washed out of the chariot when they were cleaning it, collecting in a place where dogs would lick it up, the same place where Naboth's blood was licked up, just like God said. There was no escaping, no amount of trickery, no compromise that he could make in his evil heart to escape what God had said. It's a sad ending, an ending for a very pitiful villain. It becomes even more sad when you realize all of this last sequence wouldn't have happened. He wouldn't have needed to take back Ramoth-Gilead and die trying if Ahab would have obeyed the Lord by killing Ben-Hadad years before. Instead, Ahab's continued compromising led him to grow more evil through listening to Jezebel and his sparing of Ben-Hadad, which of course led to his own death. Compromise is a killer, especially if we compromise with evil, because it will always come back to take your life. When God says destroy it, Do not compromise with it. Don't give way to it. Don't become friends with it. Don't let it pollute you. Instead, wage war against it. Annihilate it. Because what you spare and compromise today may be the arrow in your back tomorrow. Proverbs 25:26. Like a muddied spring or a polluted fountain is a righteous man who gives way before the wicked.